Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 2, Constitutionalism, BNA Act of 1867, Constitutional Act of 1982, Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And we are discussing federalism. Another important feature of Canada's constitution is federalism. Canada was the first country to establish itself as a parliamentary federation, that is, a federal system in which sovereignty is divided between the central and regional governments, both constituted according to the principles of British parliamentary democracy. In terms of division of powers, Canada is also an example of dual or divided federalism rather than shared or integrated federalism. The founders of Canada were determined to create a strong central government while at the same time assigning substantive powers to provincial legislatures that would enable them to maintain their identity, culture, and institutions. In terms of centralization, the 1867 Constitution provided that the lieutenant governors of the provinces were named and paid by the federal government and could, on federal instructions, reserve any provincial bill for approval or rejection by the Governor General in Council. The Governor General in Council could disallow any provincial law within a year of receiving a copy of it. The federal government had unlimited tax powers, whereas the provinces were limited to direct taxes within the province. Parliament could declare any local work or undertaking, although wholly located within a province, to be for the general advantage of Canada or two or more provinces, and therefore under the legislative jurisdiction of Parliament. Section 91 of the Constitution gave the federal government more exclusive powers than were held in the already existing federations of the United States and Switzerland. The federal government enjoyed residual plenary power through its general power over peace, order, and good government. In contrast to the American and later Australian models, where residual powers were allocated to the state. Federal authority was further strengthened by the fact that the senators were appointed for life by the Governor General in Council, whereas in 1867 American senators were indirectly elected by the state legislatures to represent state interests within the federal legislature. Furthermore, the Constitution gave authority to Parliament to establish a General Court of Appeal for Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada, created by Parliament in 1875, is not the final referee of constitutional disputes between the federal and provincial governments. Moreover, its judges are named by the federal government. Now, let us discuss developments in federalism. The economic, social, cultural, and political environment in which Canadian federalism operates has been changing enormously. Therefore, federalism in Canada, rather than a static structure, has been an evolving process. Richard Simon traces the following process of development in this regard. In the first few decades of Confederation, the federal government vigorously exercised its extensive powers over the provinces, including the powers of reservation and disallowance. But a powerful set of factors began to gather, and they would substantially erode federal dominance. First, the drawn out economic recession of the late 19th century sapped the new federal government's legitimacy. Second, strong provincial leaders emerged to challenge the federal dominance. The first interprovincial conference, organized by the premiers of Quebec and Ontario, Henri Mercier and Oliver Mowat, was convened in the 1887 and mounted a strong attack on Ottawa. They articulated what came to be known as the compact theory of Canadian federalism that sees the federal government largely as the creator of the provinces. Third, matters assuredly within provincial jurisdiction, such as hydroelectric power, mining, and the nascent welfare state, became more important on the national agenda, further strengthening the provincial role. Fourth, judicial decisions began to chip away at federal powers. Its powers over trade and commerce were interpreted narrowly. Its powers in international affairs were reduced by a decision that stated that while Ottawa has the power to negotiate treaties, their implementation must conform to the division of powers. Canadian scholars debate the relative significance of these influences, some focusing on the role of the courts, others on the evolution of the Canadian society and economy. Both were important, but it is interesting to note that the potentially draconian federal powers of disallowance and reservation remain in the Constitution, but they have now become constitutional dead letters, unlikely to be revived. By the 1920s, the Canadian model had come to look more like a classical dualist system. Then came the Great Economic Depression of the 1930s. Provinces alone simply could not manage the crisis. Several were on the verge of bankruptcy. Only a strong federal government, many came to believe, could alleviate the crisis. The dead hand of the existing constitution and the activism of distant courts came under the increased criticism. Harold Lasky conclusions about the obsolescence of federalism in the age of modern capitalism resonated strongly among many Canadians. A Canadian version of the American New Deal failed to meet judicial approval. Then came the World War II, during which the federal government assumed sweeping power and fiscal control. These developments provoked a major debate on the adequacy of the Canadian assignment of powers in the light of social and economic development, including the work of an important royal commission. Following the war, Canada, like all other Western democracies, embarked on the construction of the Keynesian welfare state. Most of the constitutional responsibility for the primary building blocks of the welfare state lay in provincial hands. But at the time, only the federal government had the resources and the national viewpoint to bring it about. One response in this dilemma would have been to transfer major new responsibilities to the federal government. This was done with respect to unemployment insurance and pensions through constitutional amendments. But provinces led by wealthy Ontario, British Columbia, and the Quebec blocked any further transfer of responsibilities. Canada would develop the welfare state within the existing framework of powers. The key instrument was to federal power that is only implicit in the Constitution, the spending power. This means that Ottawa can transfer funds to provinces for actions within the provincial jurisdiction, such as health and welfare, and that it can attach conditions, national standards to these funds. Expansion of the spending power in the wide variety of shared cost programs was the vehicle through which the de facto concurrency was greatly expanded and Ottawa became deeply involved in social policy. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the fastest growing areas of public lay in areas of primary provincial jurisdiction. Provincial spending and revenues grew at a faster rate than Ottawa's. In addition, new public concerns were rising: social regulation, gender equality, and the environment. None of these mentioned in the initial division of power, but that division also provided a wide variety of regulatory, spending, and taxing tools that governments at both levels could employ to become involved in the new political agenda. By the 1970s, the world was changing again. The welfare state project was essentially complete. Now, debates, deficits, and economic volatility were calling into question the expanded role of all governments. Moreover, a new set of issues had come to dominate the Canadian political agenda. Quebec's Quit Revolution generated tension, pressure for decentralization, and for a weakening of federal conditions on provincial programs. The energy wars of the 1970s generated severe regional conflicts with respect to jurisdiction over pricing, taxing, management, and regulation of energy related resources. By the turn of the century, two contradictory sets of pressures were at work. On the one hand, the fiscal crisis of the state and the concomitant rise of neo-conservative ideas about the limiting the role of government were leading to what might be called fiscally induced decentralization, best reflected in the dramatic reductions of federal transfers to the provinces and the adoption of a General Canada Health and Social Transfer in the 1995 federal budget. On the other hand, many Canadian citizens were worried about the implications of these developments for progressive social policy generally and about their consequences for national standards in the social policy that would apply equally to all Canadians. The intergovernmental response was the 1999 Social Union Framework Agreement, which attempted to set out broad national standards and an intergovernmental consensus to achieve them collectively. The evolution of the division of powers in response to judicial decisions, the aspirations of governments and citizens, and the evolving public agenda has produced two strong orders of Government of Canada, each endowed with broad authority to act. Today, however, in few areas do they act independently. Most contemporary policy issues cut across the jurisdictional boundaries originally defined in the Constitution. This has given rise to a dynamic in which the two orders are simultaneously highly independent of each other in jurisdictional terms, but highly interdependent in fiscal and policy terms. The Canadian federalism, thus, is an example of accommodating ethnic and regional aspirations, capacity to move with times, and maintenance of a Canadian identity. Now, let us wind up this lecture and thank you so much for your attention.